As many people have pointed out, and as Ukraine itself admits, this operation took 18 months to organize and execute. And I think they had large ambitions. They claimed at first that they destroyed 40 plus strategic bombers. I think they tried to target at least that many. But according to US officials, the New York Times, what they were able to confirm, it looks more like a single digit number of losses for Russian damaged or destroyed Russian strategic bombers. And it's something that Ukraine cannot replicate, which is why the Ukrainian government exposed how they did it. They know this isn't something they're going to be able to do in this way again. And this is a pattern of these type of large scale public relations stunts. They do real damage, but it's not damage that's going to change the strategic trajectory of the conflict. Russia is winning a war of attrition against Ukraine and its NATO sponsors, and primary among them, the United States. Even now, even under the Trump administration, despite claims otherwise. And they're winning because of a manpower advantage that continues to grow versus Ukrainian manpower shortage and a lack of trained manpower on the Ukrainian side. Russia is winning because of accelerated munition production, weapons and munitions, missiles, artillery shells, rockets, drones. We always hear about Ukrainian drones. Russia is also making an equal or greater number of drones with, in many cases, greater capabilities than Ukrainian drones. And they're not building drones to compensate for a lack of artillery because they have that in abundance as well. So that's why Russia is advancing on the battlefield, and not because they're trying to capture territory. They are trying to grind down Ukrainian forces. As those forces crumble, Russian forces are advancing. There's no attempt to actually break through these lines. They're just wearing them down and pushing them back. And you cannot change that by destroying some strategic bombers or blowing up the Crimean bridge, which they also tried to do again recently. And as I have explained many times over the last 3 years, you cannot isolate Crimea by destroying the Crimean bridge. Crimea returned to Russia in 2014. The bridge was completed in 2018, and the land bridge was established in 2022. So for years, Russia maintained its position in Crimea without a land bridge or an actual physical bridge. And now they have a land bridge and a physical bridge. So you're not going to isolate them. You're not going to achieve anything except headlines and boosting them around. Why are they trying to do that? Because things are in irreversible decline for the U.S. proxy war. They're desperate to freeze the conflict. This has been something people have warned about since the conflict began. If it went badly, they would try to freeze it, just like they did in Syria. And so that's where we are right now. They're putting this pressure on Russia, carrying out these very symbolic attacks to maybe try to strengthen their hands and compel Russia to capitulate to some sort of ceasefire, some sort of freeze. But I don't think Russia is going to fall for it. I think they will continue doing what we see them doing. I'm not even sure if this is a retaliation right now. I think this is just a continuation of what Russia has been doing all along.
You know, when Trump came in, there was a lot of perhaps false enthusiasm or misguided enthusiasm about the end of this conflict being near. But with this attack that Ukraine conducted and these attacks that Brian just laid out, as well as the very clear message that Putin sent Trump, what's your reaction to where this is all heading?
Yeah, well, every time there is an attempt at having some kind of peace talks, Ukraine carries out one of these attacks. Of course, when Ukraine carried out this attack, it was actually the same day there were supposed to be peace talks that were held. And I think the full time of the meeting was like 40 minutes. It was obviously a complete failure. The only thing that they agreed on was a prisoner swap. So it's very clear that they actually don't want to have real peace talks. And in terms of this attack, I think it should be pointed out that I saw that in the Western media, they kept emphasizing that Ukraine planned this attack. It was all Ukraine. And I'm very skeptical about that. I think it's very likely that the U.S. military was involved in helping to plan this. And also, I would not be surprised if in a few months, the New York Times publishes an article about how the U.S. military helped Ukraine plan this daring attack. This is a pattern we've seen again and again in the past few years. Ukraine carries out one of these kinds of attacks, and then a few months later, and originally the Western media all obediently says Ukraine did this on its own, and then a few months later it comes out that the U.S. military was behind the attack, and I expect something similar here. So we see that, one day Trump will say he wants peace talks, and then they carry out these attacks that the U.S. military is very likely involved in. So if you look at it from the perspective of Russia, why are they negotiating? I mean, this is why I think Trump has also been pretty frustrated, because one, before he even returned to the White House, he claimed that he could end the war in Ukraine. At one point, he said he would end it before he returned to the White House in the lame duck period, Biden's lame duck period. Then he claimed he would end it on his first day. That obviously didn't happen. And now it's looking more and more remote. And I think this reflects a few things. One, Russia recognizes that it's winning the war, and it will probably end up having some kind of military solution at this point. I mean, the Ukrainian military has said there have been reports that the Ukrainian military has had major shortages for well over a year now. This is why we've seen these horrible videos in social media of Ukrainian men just being basically kidnapped on the side of the road. Previously, some of those videos were men who were being conscripted and they were simply not showing up. But now there are reports that they're just random guys that are just being picked up and thrown in a van to be sent to the front line. So clearly, Ukraine has had a major shortage of personnel. There's also a major shortage of ammunition. And the Trump administration has actually continued some of the weapon sales to Ukraine, but they're not at the same scale as they were under Biden. So, I mean, it's clear that Russia won this. And I think the possibility of some kind of diplomatic breakthrough is becoming more and more unlikely, given that Ukraine just carried out this attack and they knew that it would force Russia to respond. I mean, Putin has to respond because, otherwise he would look weak and the Russian people would be very angry. I want to point out one other quick thing. Trump has been so inconsistent in his rhetoric as well.
Yes.
So this is a message that Trump posted on Truth Social, his Twitter copy, back in May. This was 2 weeks ago. He said, Putin has gone absolutely crazy. He's needlessly killing a lot of people. And then this is the crazy part. I've always said he wants all of Ukraine. And maybe that's proving right. If he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. He's threatening to overthrow the Russian government, essentially. Or destroy Russia as a country. There are different ways you can interpret that. But the downfall of Russia, that's a crazy statement. So it's so hard for foreign leaders to negotiate with the U.S. in general. Every U.S. leader is hypocritical and inconsistent. But in the case of Trump, it's just so bipolar, because Trump, he says he has a good call with Putin, like he just had, allegedly. But then this came after he threatened the downfall of Russia. How can you negotiate in this way?
Brian, there's been something going around, especially among Wall Street circles, and I certainly don't share many viewpoints with Wall Street types, but there's a term for Trump called Trump always chickens out, taco. He's been being called this. And one of the reasons for this has been, of course, the trade war. But if we just look at Ukraine, there has been this so-called push for peace that Trump came in with. And now with these attacks, it seems that these terror attacks by Ukraine are just constant. And the United States under Trump has shown very little interest in actually addressing what Putin and Russia call the root causes of this war. So what's your assessment of this and this idea of Trump constantly kind of waffling, almost backtracking at every turn?
Well, I agree with Ben. The United States was obviously behind this most recent deep drone strike on Russia's strategic bombers. It would be impossible to conduct without extensive U.S. support. The New York Times has revealed over the last 3 years that from 2014 onward, the U.S. completely captured and controls, directs, trains, and builds up Ukraine's intelligence capabilities. The SBU and military intelligence, all of these agencies are being run by the CIA. The CIA has a network of physical bases spanning all of Ukraine, and including all along the border with Russia. The U.S. military since 2022, at least 2022 onward, has been directing Ukrainian military operations. U.S. generals are at the top of the chain of command of Ukraine's armed forces, not Ukrainian commanders, not the president of Ukraine. So Ben's absolutely right about that. This is essentially just another episode of what is a U.S. war on Russia being fought through Ukraine and to a certain extent through Europe. Now, regarding President Trump's claims that he was going to end the war in 24 hours or even before stepping foot into office, he was clearly telling people what they wanted to hear. If people listened carefully, J.D. Vance, even before the Trump administration took office, after winning the election, he openly said that they're going to dump Ukraine onto Europe and pursue the very same type of conflict, only with China, because that is their top priority. There's an article out there somewhere about we shouldn't be wasting weapons on Ukraine. We need them to fight China. And then President Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, back in February, delivered a directive. And I say this every time I come on, in Brussels, he told Europe, you're going to take over. You're going to freeze the conflict. You're going to put troops on the ground. You're going to expand arms production. You're going to double down on sending those arms to Ukraine while we pivot to China. This is about division of labor, dividing up the labor of U.S. empire among its European proxies and also its proxies in Asia. And it's also about strategic sequencing. China is the more immediate threat to American primacy over the planet. We can circle back around and get Russia later. We wanted to finish Russia first, then go to China, but that's not possible. So now there's this strategic sequencing taking place. And this is described in corporate funded policy papers published a year, 2 years, 4 years before Trump even contested elections in 2024.
You've come on the show and you've said, the focus for the United States is now on China. But one of the interesting things that keeps happening with the Ukraine conflict is that the United States, despite the rhetoric and despite even all of what Brian has said, like transitioning this conflict to Europe, it seems that the United States is not only very deeply involved, but as you said, with this attack is there were reports that Pete Hegseth was getting direct intelligence about this attack on Russia's bombers as it was happening. It just seems like the United States is still very deeply not only involved in this conflict, but it seems like there are deep vested interests in keeping it going. What's your response to that?
Yeah, well, again, this is the point I always make when we talk about this, Danny, which is that you have to think about it from the perspective of Russia. If it's in the winning position, obviously, so if they're going to negotiate, what is the leverage that the U.S. has? What are the concessions that the U.S. can make to Russia that would lead to them making some kind of political settlement in a war that they're winning? I mean, if there's no political settlement, Russia has already won, but it's going to be completely definite, a complete military victory. So the U.S. has really two main things that it can give Russia. One, it can lift sanctions. Now, first of all, these are unilateral sanctions which violate international law, and Russia also has economically not been doing very badly. There are reports that its economy is slowing down this year, but in the past 2 years, Russia's economy was growing very healthily, faster than the U.S. economy, which the U.S. is running over 6% deficit, 6% of GDP deficits. And in Europe, there are many countries that are stagnant or even potentially in recession. So economically, Russia has been doing quite well. And Russia has been economically integrating more and more with Asia, not only with China, but also with India and even Turkey and other parts of Asia. So the sanctions are, of course, something that Russia would like to see lifted, obviously, but it's not a deal breaker. Like we're not going to sacrifice other interests just to lift the sanctions, given that in many ways, the sanctions have encouraged Russia to be more economically self-sufficient. Russia has been reindustrializing, not only massively expanding military output, but manufacturing output of cars and car parts and machinery. So there's that aspect. And then the other aspect is that Trump says, okay, we'll make some kind of deal. Russia can have, the U.S. will recognize that that Crimea and the Donbass are now part of Russia. But for Russia, I mean, that's not even up for negotiation. I mean, there are already referenda first of all, Crimea is part of Russia. It has been for over a decade. I mean, it was always a bureaucratic move by Khrushchev that made Crimea part of the Ukrainian SSR back when it was all the Soviet Union. It was all the same country. I mean, Crimea is part of Russia. It's never been up for negotiation. The Donbass, they already had referenda. These 4 republics in the Donbass are also now part of Russia. From Moscow's perspective, that's not up for negotiation. So, I mean, the U.S. doesn't really have much that it can offer other than and Trump also says, okay, we will normalize political relations with you so we can focus on attacking China. Trump said this in October in an interview with Tucker Carlson. He said that he can divide Russia and China. He said confidently that he thought he could do it. Obviously, he has not succeeded. And President Xi Jinping took a trip to Moscow this May to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the end of the European theater of World War II, the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany, in what in Russia is known as the Great Patriotic War, and what in China is known as the World Anti-Fascist War. And when Xi was in Moscow, he signed an agreement with Putin, an 8,000-word joint statement. And in this, China and Russia reaffirmed in clear terms that their partnership is deep, is as strong as it ever has been. It is at the best stage it has ever been. And they said in that statement that they will not allow foreign powers, third countries, to try to divide them, which was an obvious reference to the U.S. attempt to divide them. So you look at all of the geopolitical aspects, not even just the military aspects, where Russia's clearly winning, despite, these symbolic attacks carried out by Ukraine every few months that don't really do that much damage, but they get a lot of media headlines, which is the main point. But if you look at Russia's winning militarily, but then you look at all of the other geopolitical elements, it's not in Russia's interest to make some kind of deal with the U.S. unless the U.S. can make significant concessions, which Trump is not willing to do. And then you have the issue of Europe, because, as Brian was just discussing, the U.S. is telling Europe, this is your problem. You have to deal with it. So what this means is that these European leaders have all not abandoned this extremely antagonistic line. And from Russia's perspective, it's probably more important to normalize at least economic relations with Europe than with the U.S. Because, the U.S. can lift sanctions on Russia. I already talked about that. I mean, that would be helpful, but it's not a deal breaker. But the U.S. and Russia even before 2022, they didn't really do that much trade. Whereas Russia and Western Europe did a lot of trade, especially Central Europe, Germany, of course. And Russia would like to go back to trading with some European countries. I mean, it's also not a deal breaker, because if you look at European imports of gas and oil also, for instance, Europe is now importing lots of liquefied natural gas from the U.S., which is significantly more expensive than Russian pipeline gas and worse for the environment, by the way. And Germany has invested billions of euros in making new terminals to process the liquefied natural gas coming from the U.S. So what happened with Russia is they simply rerouted that oil and gas to Asia, especially to China and India. But Russia has also been selling it at a discount. So Russia would like to go back to trading with Europe, of course. But then Europe has not abandoned this extremely antagonistic anti-Russia policy. And even if Trump can somehow come to an agreement with Russia, will Europe be party to this agreement? Probably not. I mean, if there is some kind of agreement, Europe will not be able to continue waging this war, because the only reason that Ukraine has been able to continue fighting is because of U.S. support. If U.S. support officially ends, and as I mentioned, I mean, Trump has withdrawn some of it, but he's still sending weapons. Not as many as Biden, but he's still sending them. If the U.S. completely ends support, the war will have to end. So the question is, will it end with a Russian military victory or some kind of agreement? Will Europe be part of the diplomatic agreement? Probably not, which means that Europe will still have sanctions on Russia. Now, Europe doesn't control the international financial system like the US does, but Europe did trade with Russia before, and Russia's not really concerned about trading with the US. I mean, the US and Russia are the number 2 largest oil and gas exporters in the world. The US is a deindustrialized country. What is Russia going to buy from it? Russia has all of the oil and gas and minerals and grains and other commodities that it needs. So again, it's just people need to think about it more geopolitically and think about it from Russia's perspective, like what he would get from making some kind of grand bargain with the US. Again, this goes back to this idea that Trump constantly reiterates, we have all the cards. No, they don't actually. The US does not have that many cards at this point. It does have control over the international financial system, but Russia has already created an alternative payment system. Russia is obviously deeply invested in BRICS. The BRICS summit was held last year in Kazan in Russia, and they came to many important new agreements, including plans for offshore, because Russia has de-dollarized its trade with China. Over 90% of their bilateral trade is in yuan and rubles. It's de-dollarized its trade with India using rubles and rupees. It's de-dollarized its trade with Iran. So Russia has already done that, and now the issue is dealing with trade imbalances, and they're making offshore commodities exchanges to deal with these trade imbalances. So, I mean, this is the whole point, that these sanctions have actually made Russia more sovereign and self-sufficient. So they're not like begging to end the sanctions either. So again, I think all of the geopolitical momentum is on deepening Russia's integration with Asia. And that's why ultimately they started this whole new phase of the war that goes back to 2014. It was the US that started this war with the coup in Ukraine in 2014, but this new phase in 2022. The whole reason that they initiated this is because they knew that their future lies in integration with Asia, and that the US would never tolerate Russia as an equal peer. It would only tolerate Russia integrating into the West and in the G8 as a subservient vassal like it was under Boris Yeltsin.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is exactly what I was going to say. What is the underlying agenda that compels the US to maintain NATO, holds primacy, control over Europe, and use Europe and especially Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, because ultimately wants to subordinate Russia as part of a wider plan to encircle, contain Iran and ultimately China. And so how can you negotiate with the US? All Russia or China or Iran could do is negotiate to buy time to continue building up this alternative system Ben was describing, and just time out the clock. One thing that I think many people can agree, the United States is still extremely dangerous, has asymmetric capabilities it can use to undermine and destroy, if not Russia, Iran, and China directly, nations all along the periphery. But it's no longer able to use military force to coerce all of these nations directly. What it's doing more and more now is holding peace, prosperity, stability hostage, and using that as leverage over these countries. Telling Russia, if you don't submit to us, China, if you don't do what we tell you, we will destabilize and destroy everything. And if not inside your country, everything along your borders and in your region of the planet. That's what I would like to follow up with.
So I mentioned that when President Xi Jinping visited Moscow and met with President Putin, they signed a joint statement. It was over 8,000 words. Now, there's not an official English language translation. I did an article about this, and I'm showing a clip of it. And this is an unofficial English translation that was done by a Chinese journalist who's a friend of mine. And in this joint statement signed by Xi and Putin, they made a very interesting comment that's related to our discussion here. So I talked about this part. The two sides firmly oppose efforts to incite other countries to adopt hostile positions toward Russia and China around the world and to smear China-Russia cooperation. Okay, but this is what's really fascinating about the quote, is they said, China and Russia will strengthen coordination and resolutely respond to the U.S. implementation of dual containment against China and Russia. that was a very important line. And again, this is signed by Putin and Xi, acknowledging that even though, you know, Russian diplomats who are very smart, some of the best diplomats in the world, they know that Trump publicly said he wants to divide Russia and China. And there's been this big debate in Washington about the reverse Kissinger, which, as I point out, actually is not the reverse Kissinger, it's the original Kissinger, because Kissinger himself had advocated back in 1972 when he visited China. He said that in a few decades, the US would have to do the opposite and ally with Russia against China. So, but the point is that Russian diplomats know that this discussion is happening in Washington. And in that statement, they said that's not going to happen. But they also said that we know that you still want to contain us. It's dual containment. It's not just against China. So I think what this shows is that, you know, there are some people, certainly, you know, the Russiagate Democrats who have always been just living on Mars. This idea that like Trump just loves Russia and he's a Putin puppet. That's obviously absurd. But even now, when Trump is making all of these diplomatic outreaches to Putin, although, as I pointed out earlier, then a few weeks later, he'll post something on Truth Social calling Putin crazy. So it's this very bipolar situation. But he'll say, I had a great call with Putin. I have a great relationship with Putin. But then if you look at the statements that Putin is signing with China, he's making it very clear that they recognize that Russia is still being targeted by the US in a dual containment strategy.